You're listening to the OCD Stories podcast, hosted by me, Stuart Ralph. The OCD Stories is a podcast dedicated to raising awareness and understanding around obsessive-compulsive symptoms. I do this through interviewing inspired therapists, psychologists, and people who have experienced OCD. Welcome to the OCD Stories.
And welcome to episode 367. And in this one, I chat with Dr. Chad LeJeune. Chad is a professor of psychology at the University of San Francisco and author of the books The Worry Trap and more recently, Pure OCD, Letting Go of Obsessive Thoughts with Acceptance and Commitment Therapy. Now, I interviewed Chad back in 2016, so it was great to get him back on the show to talk about his new book. So in particular, we start by setting up what is Pure OCD, what is Acceptance and Commitment Therapy, or ACT for short. He shares what's in his book and what you'll find. When does a thought become an obsession? Skills to diffuse from sticky thoughts. His acronym LLAMP and how it can help. How to learn ACT skills so that they are remembered. Learning to let go of fighting with horrible, disturbing thoughts. Discovering your values and how to live by them, and so much more. And thank you to our new podcast partner, JS Health Vitamins. JS Health is an Australian wellness brand. Jessica Seppel is a nutritionist and founder behind JS Health, and also a dedicated listener to the OCD Stories podcast. In fact, she says it changed her life, and she found her therapist through our podcast, which she's been seeing for almost 3 years. Jess has always been very open about her mental health journey, including anxiety and pure OCD, and is passionate about opening up this conversation and supporting her community to feel healthy, happy, and confident. This level of care that Jess has is really what sets JS Health Vitamins apart. Their range of vitamin formulas are solution-focused, meaning they are designed to target your main health concerns and support a whole range of wellness goals. Created using some of the highest quality ingredients, backed by science at a therapeutic dose, that's what they are known for, verified by tens of thousands of real customers all around the world. And they are always GF and GMO free, made with ingredients you can trust to high Australian standards. They've given me an exclusive discount code for you all. Head to jshealthvitamins.com and use the code OCD Stories at checkout for a generous 15% off the entire range. You can also head to the show notes for all the info, including the discount code. So thank you to Jessica and JS Health for supporting the show.
And thank you to NOCD for supporting the podcast. NOCD offers effective and convenient therapy available in the US and outside the US. To find out more about NOCD, their therapy plans, if they currently take your insurance, or to download their free app, head to go.treatmyocd.com/the OCD stories, or the link will be in the episode description.
So thank you to you guys, as always, for listening to the podcast, sharing it, liking it, whatever you do. I deeply appreciate it. And without further ado, here is Chad. Welcome back to the show, Chad.
Thanks. Good to be here, Stu.
Yes, good to have you back on. So today we're going to talk about your book, Pure OCD, in quite a bit of detail, hopefully. But I guess, it was 2016 when we last spoke. So how have things been going for you since that time?
Oh, well, like as with everyone else, many, many things have changed. Working remotely, and that was part of the impetus for writing the book is, I kind of scaled back my clinical hours. So I had a little more time on my hands, and it was kind of a way of coping with the pandemic was to just have a project. And so it all came together. It was the right time to do it. So.
Good. I'm glad. And what I thought would be good initially is your book is, of course, about acceptance and commitment therapy, using that for Pure OCD. So I guess maybe initially to define what is Pure O.
Sure. So Pure O is a very unofficial term, right? But it's the term that has kind of come about organically. It's what people use online, and so I think we meet people where they are by adopting whatever terminology people are using. And it describes a type of OCD that's very often overlooked or misdiagnosed, often mistaken for something else, because the compulsive part is not so obvious. It's there, but it's not as apparent. So when people think of OCD, they often think of people who have rituals, who do, people think about germophobia and hand washing, cleaning, ordering. With Pure O, the rituals sometimes are completely cognitive So thought rituals, people kind of, having to recite certain arguments to themselves over and over again, or seeking reassurance from other people, or even just avoiding something can be a compulsion. So for example, someone who has a lot of trouble making decisions, but and who avoids actually making decisions. It could be an example of pure O. I had one gentleman that I worked with who, when I met him, had 3 brand new television sets in his living room because he couldn't decide which one had the best picture, right? So that was sort of a ritual in a way. It was the compulsive part was not choosing a television and living with 3, right? So it can be subtle. Pure O is often mistaken for something else, and most alarmingly, individuals often think that there's something much more serious going on when it's really just pure O.
Yeah, good point. So what I think would be good is to just define what's ACT, what's acceptance and commitment therapy.
So, most people are becoming more familiar with cognitive therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy, which focuses on behavior change by changing our thoughts. So ACT is a type of behavior therapy, except instead of really focusing on changing the thoughts, it's more about changing our relationship to the thoughts, which I think is especially important with OCD and in particular with pure O, because the thoughts are sometimes a trap. And so trying to change the thoughts or argue with the thoughts can actually easily evolve into another form of obsessing. And so ACT is more focused on this relational shift between myself and the thoughts. And it really starts with recognizing that your thoughts are not you, they're just another part of your experience, and that the problem isn't so much with the thought itself, but with how you're relating to it. So it's a bit of a shift. And some people have talked about ACT as a metacognitive sort of approach, right? In that it's a different way of thinking about thoughts themselves.
Yeah, really good point. So maybe the next step would be just to hear more about your book. So why write it? What's in it?
So my practice for the past almost 30 years has been very focused on working with people with anxiety. And what's happened more and more is I found myself working with more and more people with OCD over time, and just realizing how there's not a lot of information out there on pure O. I actually, just trying to find books for clients to read about pure O. It's pretty limited. There were some really excellent books out there, but most of the literature really focused on more traditional forms of OCD. So I felt there was a need. The way the book is structured, there's 2 parts to the book. The first half is all about sort of how thoughts become obsessions. And I think that's really important in that, just understanding how obsessive thoughts are different from other thoughts is really key to actually changing our relationship to those thoughts, right? The thing is, we think all the time, and so we usually treat our thoughts as our friends. And so we follow our thoughts around because they help us to get through the day. And so the whole first half of the book is really understanding that these thoughts are very different. And why are they different? How do they become obsessions? So we talk about cognitive fusion in the beginning of the book, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. But sort of understanding that anxiety causes a change in sort of how we relate to thoughts, and that change affects several things. So there's a chapter on magic, in that a big part of our experience of OCD is that thoughts are magical, and that what we're thinking will have an effect on something happening in the world. And so we have to control our thoughts in order to control events in the world. And so I, kind of understanding that as a form of magical thinking. Talk about our perception of time, that a lot of obsessing about things that happened in the past, for example, has to do with our experience of the past as though it's happening now and as though we could change it now. And so we have this fight or flight response, right? Or the future. Some people think about the future as something that is fixed and determined, right? And that there's nothing they can do about it. And so it's sort of looking at how anxiety affects our perceptions of time. And then there's a chapter on the self in terms of a lot of OCD symptoms are about protecting the self. And it sort of asks the question of what is the self and what are we trying to protect, really? And how do we think we can be fundamentally changed by an experience like a thought, right? And is that real? So the first half is giving people a lot of food for thought to think about some very fundamental things like what is a thought? What is my relationship to a thought? How do I decide what to do at any given moment? So some very basic questions, but questions that I think are really relevant to OCD. Second half of the book is how do I apply this newfound insight into, what a thought is and what is a fused thought. And it's about making those thoughts less sticky and not being so fused with our thoughts. So it's second half is much more about skills, and it presents 5 different tools that people can use to kind of change that relationship.
Nice, thank you. And when does a thought become an obsession?
So cognitive fusion is something that's sort of a refrain in the book. And basically what we're talking about with cognitive fusion is it's part of the fight or flight response. So when we're faced with something that's uncertain, part of what our brain does to protect us is to give us thoughts about what this thing might be. So the example I use a lot in the book is something coming through the bushes. So I don't know what this thing is. And so the thing coming from the bushes could be, the future of a relationship, or whether or not this job I'm considering taking is going to work out, right? Or whether or not the bathroom floor is really clean, right? So there's an element of uncertainty in life. And so evolutionarily speaking, this is the thing that was coming through the bushes, and we don't know what it is. So our body tries to prepare for that with the fight or flight response. We get very increased heart rate, all that stuff. But the mind also starts to give us thoughts about what it might be. It could be a lion or a tiger or a bear, something that will hurt you, right? So most of us are familiar with that. We understand that there's a change in the content of our thoughts, right? But what I talk about in the book is that the other thing that changes is sort of how we relate to those thoughts. And so when we're very anxious, we respond to the thought of the lion, tiger, or bear the same way we would respond to a real lion or tiger or bear. So our thoughts become more real to us. And so we have the same fight or flight response to just a thought, right, that we would have to an actual threat. So just the very possibility that the bathroom floor is not really clean leads to the same response that we'd have as if it was harmful to us in some way, right? And so that's cognitive fusion. And the fusion refers to the thought and the thing the thought refers to, the reality, are fused in our experience. We know that they're separate, but our experience is that they're the same. And this can happen in really subtle ways. So, for example, a very common thing that most people can relate to is even if they've had a series of wins and they've been pretty successful, that sometimes they might feel like they're a fraud, right? They may, all the feedback says you're good enough, you're doing a pretty good job, but they might say, well, it doesn't feel like it, right? That can be an example of cognitive fusion, right? That there's this, lots of evidence that things are okay, but it doesn't feel okay, right? And so, that's this sort of evolutionary hangover that we sort of have as human beings, where we have this experience that's there to protect us, right? Just in case we're going to have this experience that, yes, it is a lion, tiger, or bear. But the problem is if you're, sort of responding to that all the time as though it's real, then it becomes more of a problem. It's not actually helping you.
Mm. Yeah, good points. I'm glad you mentioned what's coming through the bushes. I really enjoyed that in the book. I thought it was a really good metaphor, analogy. I get the two confused, but yeah, I really like that. So what are some skills to diffuse?
So, so the 5 sort of buckets of skills that I talk about in the book, they're kind of captured by an acronym, LLAMP, LLAMP, 2 L's. So the first one is labeling, and that's very powerful, right? Just identifying what's going on, to just call our attention, and very often that's enough. So for example, something that I noticed the other day, I was out on a walk, and I was just thinking about something that happened a couple of years ago that was upsetting at the time, something I hadn't thought about in quite a while. And as I'm thinking about it, I'm getting all upset all over again, right? And then it just occurred to me, I'm ruminating, right? Just a simple word, just a word that describes thinking about the past, but having a fight or flight response as though it's happening now. And just that word, that label, really helps. It shifted. It's like, oh, I'm ruminating. Okay. And it was a lot easier to just stop ruminating because I'd identified what was happening, right? And I realized I didn't want to be doing that, right? So labeling is very powerful. And so we talk about, there's a whole chapter in the book on how to be more effective in the labels that we apply to what we're doing, and just to develop that habit of putting a label on what's happening right now. The second skill is letting go. And so that has to do with sort of physically actually letting go of our physical struggle to control or change what we're doing or what we're thinking. And it's really basic stuff. It's like taking a breath. It's about relaxing your muscles. It's just reminding yourself to let go of that instinctual struggle, right? Which is something that people, of course, know that they want to do, but unless you bring your focus and intent to it, the go-to is to continue to struggle, right? And so it's about physically being able to step back. The acceptance piece is more about very specific diffusion techniques. There's a lot of emphasis on using humor as a way to change our relationship to our thoughts, right? So just sort of when we interact with a thought in a playful way, it tells the anxious part of our brain, hey, this thought isn't so dangerous because look, I'm actually making fun of it. I'm kind of hanging out with it. I'm doing different things with it. Other examples from that chapter would be writing a thought down, right? Write the thought down, put it in your pocket, carry it around, look at it a few times a day. Again, all part of changing your relationship to it, part of really accepting that it's there as a thought. So LLA, label, let go, acceptance. The M of the LAMP is mindfulness, trying to bring yourself more into the moment. So it's a chapter there on just connecting more. People think about mindfulness meditation when they think about mindfulness, and I certainly mention that in the book, but so many people I know don't like to meditate or they don't have time to meditate. And so I talk about other things that people can do. You're just going for a walk, right? But not being in your head on the walk. Talk about a mindful way of walking. Things like interacting with a cat or a dog, things like fly fishing, knitting, cooking, right? All activities that require us to be a little bit more present and grounded in what's happening now. And to the extent that we're grounded in that part of our experience, we're less engaged with the thoughts, right? So it's not so much a distraction as sort of a shift of locus of where we are. We're more grounded in what we're doing, so we can observe our thoughts the same way, we can sort of maybe observe whatever the meal that we're cooking or the blanket we're knitting, right? So that's mindfulness. And then the last one is the P is purpose or proceeding, but it's all about moving forward with a sense of values in terms of what's important and what do I want to be doing at any given moment to express sort of meaning in my life. So much of what people complain about, people who are struggling with OCD, is that they feel that they're wasting a lot of time and energy, that the time they're spending on an obsession or compulsion doesn't feel like it's adding anything to their life, right? And so this is, to get people thinking about, if I wasn't, spending so much time and energy on this, what would I be doing? What would that look like? Even small things that we can choose that sort of move things forward in terms of our values and have a sense of purpose.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of toolbox, right, in the second half of the book.
I really like the acronym and the stages, and as you say, it very much aligns with ACT. Obviously, you created it from ACT, but the thing I've found with ACT, and when I use it with my clients, and there's lots of ACT acronyms I use with clients, and it's kind of getting them to make it habitual in terms of that they go to this acronym a lot, they use it, they go through the stages. How do you do that, or how do you work with that with your clients to get them to say adopt this acronym and really kind of put it to good use?
So it's difficult, right? And I think it's always a challenge. It's one thing to read a book and to look at a model and say, well, that makes sense, right? It's another thing to actually start to use it, right? So what I like about ACT in general is I think it's a very flexible approach, right? And I try to convey that sense of flexibility in the book, that this is just one way of kind of organizing these tools, and that for each of us, there may be some tools that work better than others. For some people, mindfulness is just out the window. It's just not realistic. And so fine, don't use mindfulness, right? So what I often say is that the LAMP could instead be a LAP or a LA, right? That sometimes maybe there's just one of those 5 tools that really resonates for you, that is effective. And so it's not about doing it the right way, right? It's about trying these different things and seeing what helps, right? And what seems to be useful. And so, for some people, I think walking through all 5 steps can feel very daunting. And so I often suggest with my patients that, they just try it. We start with one thing, let's just do some labeling this week, right? And I ask people to kind of come back with a list of moments when they were triggered and what label did they use to describe what was happening, right? And so just having that specific assignment, it will give them an opportunity to experiment with labeling, right? And then we might add, something else to it after that, right? So, again, it's not about following one specific program. It's more what I hope people will take away from the book is more a sense of the spirit of what we're looking at, and that the level of change that we're looking at. It's not about changing our thoughts or even immediately changing our behavior. It's about changing our relationship to all of that, sort of carrying it in a different way. And I think that approaching it with a sense of experimentation can be really helpful, right? And sort of see what you discover. And for everyone, I think it's a different journey.
Yeah, I like that. So yeah, break it down and teach it in stages and implement it in stages. And then, changing your mindset or relationship to it. And with when you're working with people with OCD, do you still bring in traditional ERP alongside ACT, or do you use ACT solely? Or
so I think there's always an element of exposure, and I tend to focus more on the exposure part than the response prevention part. I think that's the main choice, difference in a way between ACT and ERP, in that the exposure itself is an intervention in that it's sort of changing any avoidance. When the avoidance is part of the compulsion, well, if you're exposing yourself, of course, right, that takes care of that. The response prevention part, I've never been comfortable with just the phrase response prevention. To me, it sounds like just telling someone, stop that, don't do that, basically, which, people have been telling people with OCD that all their whole lives, right? So it's just, I think what ACT does, it emphasizes values. And so I think it's getting people to say, well, what is the value of that for you, right? And if you were really acting your values, would you do that, or would you do something else, right? Yeah. So I definitely think that the treatment plans that come out of ACT for OCD emphasize a lot of exposure. They may not call it exposure. They may call it value-guided action, right? And the response prevention part, I think, is not so focused on that if you're living your values, your responses will change, right? The idea of response prevention, it just reeks of struggle, right? And control. And that's the problem in OCD, right? So I don't think it should be central to the solution.
Yeah, interesting way to look at it. Yeah, thank you for sharing. Yeah, of course, living by your values, you're naturally going to have to put yourself in situations that would be considered an exposure, you know?
Right.
Yeah.
And I think what happens certainly when people come to therapy and they're looking at an ERP treatment plan, I think that they bring a lot of fear and a lot of resistance to that, right? And certainly if you watch, I'm thinking about some of the reality television shows where you see people going through exposure therapy, right? It's a battle, right? It's a battle between the therapist and the patient. And I don't think that that's the most productive relationship to have. And it's, I think there's a better way. And I think that if people can be more connected with their values, and if they, can sort of, in a gentle way, make room for some discomfort, then there will be shifting and there will be change. It may not be as dramatic, right, as it could be with ERP, but I think it will happen, and it will be kinder and gentler, and more people will be willing to do it. Right.
Yeah, good point. I think as you make space for discomfort and all these difficult thoughts and feelings, which of course is what ACT's trying to do, it's trying to get the person to allow it to exist. You're less likely to do compulsions anyway, because you're only really doing compulsions because you don't want these experiences. So you're doing the compulsion to get rid of it. And if you can start to be okay with the experience, the compulsions should hopefully drop off anyway.
Absolutely. I think it's a really good point, Stuart, that, if we, part of what allows us to not engage in compulsions is just if we're more relaxed, right? If we're sort of able to sort of let go a little bit on a physical level and not struggle as much, we have more flexibility and we can choose not to engage in a compulsion. I think that a lot of, what we're doing sometimes with very aggressive ERP treatment, is we're encouraging people to really white knuckle it, right? And to increase their level of control and increase their tension, to resist, right? And fight against that compulsion. And it may be effective in the short term, right? But I think that, it can also lead to just more struggle and more tension, right? And so, yeah, I just think and not to say that the ERP can't be really effective for just straight up ERP, but I think if it can be tempered with more, mindfulness, more acceptance-based stuff, I think it'll go down a lot easier.
Yeah, exactly. Which reminds me of like taking your medicine, and when they started mixing it with flavorings and stuff, it's kind of like that. Acts the flavoring,
Absolutely, I like that.
Yeah. So this next question I thought of, almost playing devil's advocate of, I don't know if that's the right expression, but with Pure O, a lot of it's taboo and very uncomfortable and disturbing and ego dystonic. So with ACT generally, and with the LLAMP acronym, some of it like letting go and acceptance and allowing, and some people are going to really resist and push back against that with these really disturbing thoughts. I guess, how would you work with someone who's pushing back because of that?
Yeah. So, I could write a book about that.
Yeah.
And I guess I did. But part of it is, I think, the urgency that people feel about getting a handle on these thoughts, or controlling or getting rid of the thoughts, has to do with a very basic mistake, which is that these thoughts are them, right? That this is me, and So, I can't have these thoughts because it makes me a bad person, right? And so I think really working with this idea that, your thoughts are part of your experience, but they're not you, right? And you just understand that in a very fundamental way and reminding yourself of that by looking at the thought and saying, that's not me, right? That's a thought, and I don't like the thought. And that's me. The not liking part of it is me. That's my sense of who I am. That you mentioned, it's dystonic, right? It's not me. And so it's okay because it's not me, right? And it doesn't really change who I am just because I have this thought, right? I think that concept, when people can really look at that and really understand and embrace that, brings a lot of comfort to people and makes it a little easier for them to struggle less. But the other thing is, certainly when you hear something like let go, accept, the instinct is, how could I accept something so horrible, right? How could I not struggle with something that's so upsetting to me? The thing to keep in mind is struggling is not a binary concept. It's not like you're either struggling or you're not struggling. It's not, when we talk about acceptance, it's not that you have to be 100% accepting, right? So the question is, could you struggle a little bit less, right? At any given moment, could you choose to struggle a little bit less? And so it's not so much about being okay with a thought. It's about a shift in that relationship. What can help is to think about other relationships that we have, right? So relationships with friends, with neighbors, with coworkers. Most of us have had people that we choose to interact with who we don't just love, right? Who maybe are triggering for us. And yet we can often find a way to coexist with those people, interact with them, to work together on a project with them, to be in the room with them, maybe for one day a year. I'm thinking family members and holidays, right? Where, we can just do what works. And the way we do that is by choosing not to fight, not to try to change that person, right? To just sort of shift how we're relating for a limited period of time. And so it's doing that with our thoughts, right? It's recognizing we have the ability to hold a thought in a different way, maybe just for a little while, right? And that's an important start. Right? Yeah. So it's it's introducing people to the idea that this can be incremental, right? And certainly with OCD, we're never looking at 100% cure, right? Because what we're talking about is the way we think, and that's fundamental, right, to our experience. And so it's not likely to completely change. So we're talking about gradual and incremental changes.
Good point. Yeah, not expecting a miracle overnight. Right. Just little shifts. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Which is, I think a much easier place to start.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people feel a lot of relief at that concept, that so I don't have to have this revolution and everything doesn't have to be completely different right away. Yeah. Right. And I can just, what can I do that feels doable now? And where else could we possibly start than there?
Yeah, really good point. So let's talk about values. So how do people figure out their values, and then more importantly, how do they take steps towards that, or live by those values each day?
So values is a big question, right? And I think that it's a lifelong sort of quest to gain clarity about what our values are, and to stay in touch with them and to consistently act on them, right? So, there's a chapter in my book on values. There are exercises that I put out there to help people to think about what's important. Very often we become confused. Am I doing this because I value it, or am I doing this because I'm afraid not to do it, for example, right? Values can look like different things. So part of it's just having a clearer way to think about our values. But in terms of really being in touch with what we value, often I think it comes to us based on events in our lives. Something happens and it clarifies what's really important to us, right? I think the loss of a loved one, for example, when we lose someone, it can often really impact people's awareness of what's really important to them and change their behavior with the other people that they still have in their lives, right? The pandemic is another thing. I think a lot of when you ask people about how the pandemic changed their lives, what they're doing differently, very often what they're talking about are their values, and that it raised their awareness of what's really important about connection with other people. So I think that, it's not simply a matter of talking to a therapist or reading a book or doing an exercise to make a list. These are my values, right? I think that it's asking yourself that question in an ongoing way and paying attention to your own behavior. I think often our choices can tell us a lot about what we value, especially in moments of crisis. What we're choosing to do can tell us a lot about what's really important. And if we kind of take note of that and can hold on to that learning, I think it can really give us more clarity. I don't think that in terms of certainly the way I talk about values in the book, it's not so much about creating a list of what your values are. Most people have an idea of that. That's continually evolving, right? It's more about being in touch with your values when you're making choices. It's more about connecting with your values on a deep level when you're anxious and when you're obsessing about something, as a way of sort of tethering you to a part of yourself that is separate from and independent of the obsessions or the compulsions. The thing about values is they don't change from day to day. They're very enduring parts of us, right? Thoughts, anxiety, they come and go, right? Anxiety goes up and down. We have good days, we have bad days, right? It really changes like the weather. Our values don't do that. They tend to be more enduring and stable. So being in touch with them puts us in touch with the part of ourselves that is sort of separate from our thoughts. So when I talk about this idea of that's not you, that thought that you feel like you have to battle with isn't you, right? What is me? Well, that's where the values come in, right? That, being in touch with our values and choices that are guided by that gives us a sense of who we are in a more enduring way. And the more we have clarity about that, the less likely we are to make the mistake of thinking that we are our thoughts or our anxiety.
Yeah, really good point. I like what you said, that values don't change that much or that often. They're much more stable and reliable than thoughts, feelings, and all of that. And if we're navigating our day by our thoughts and feelings, it may feel quite turbulent, especially if those thoughts and feelings aren't that pleasant. Whereas our values, they're much more reliable. I liked what you said about it being an ongoing realization, I guess, figuring out your values. And I've definitely found that. No, thank you. So let's say you could pick up the phone and call the 20-year-old you. What would you tell him? Was that a question I had back in 2016? Do you remember?
No, that's a new one. And I think it's a good question. I guess, first of all, I would have a few things to say to my 20-year-old self. But more than telling him something, I would actually want to listen to my 20-year-old self. As I get a little bit older, I actually think there's a lot that I've forgotten that my 20-year-old self kind of knew intuitively. I think as life goes along, we get caught up in, a sense of obligation, taking care of stuff, just maintaining the infrastructure of our lives, right? Professional goals. I think when I was 20, I was probably more in touch with the importance of relationships in my life. My friends were really, really important to me in my 20s. Having fun, right? So there's a lot that I think we forget. And so I would actually want to sit down and just hear what my 20-year-old self had to say to me to start. But if I was going to say one thing to my 20-year-old self, I think I would tell him to slow down and that there would be plenty of time to do all these things, goal-directed sort of things, and to just take things in a little bit more, have more fun, a little more fun, maybe. I was very goal-directed in my 20s. So I think I could have had more fun than I did. So, but I'd like to have a beer with my 20-year-old self and just hear what I had to say about what was going on then, right? Because I think I've forgotten a lot.
Yeah, that's an interesting concept. I don't know if I'd want to. I think that'd be quite scary. Yeah. And you've got a billboard. What do you want written on that billboard?
Now that one you did ask me before. Okay. I remember that one. And I think what I said last time was breathe, right? And just reminding people, to kind of connect with the moment a little bit. And breathing is one way to do that, right? To kind of relax and be in the moment and kind of give the body sort of what it needs on a most basic level, right? I think there's a lot of different things that I could put on that billboard, but it's really hard to capture something that's that brief, right? That can be useful to people. So I think what I would do right now, given that I just finished a 200-page book that's full of that stuff, is what I put on the billboard is something much more conventional, just a big picture of my book with the words, read my book. So I would be very crassly commercial with my billboard right now. And I would just direct people to a lot of stuff that I have to say about being more in the moment, being more grounded with our values, and sort of letting go of our struggle to control what we're thinking and what we're feeling.
Yeah, absolutely. Good point. And maybe your publisher can put out a billboard somewhere.
That would be great. I would love that.
Excellent. So lastly, is there anything else you wish you could have said or shared today?
Boy, I think we covered it. Let's see, I'm just looking here. One thing I will say that I didn't mention about the book is I included a lot of stories in the book. So part of what I think happens with Pure O, it's something that hasn't been talked about a lot, right? I think a lot of people with Pure O, even if they understand what's going on with them as OCD, they often feel very isolated because this is not the way OCD presents for most people. There are not a lot of, you don't see movies about people with Pure O, right? You see people, movies about people with, more traditional forms of OCD. So there are 6 individuals that I introduce in the book, and based on patients that I worked with over the years, and I give their whole stories, right? I'm explaining sort of what were the obsessions that they struggled with, what treatment looked like, and the degree of success. And I tried to be, very honest about that. Not everyone succeeded in their treatment, right? And that's real, right? That people, not everything, one thing doesn't work for everyone. And we often have to try different things until we find something that works. So I try to tell some stories of real people, hoping that readers would feel that they had some companionship and they aren't so alone in that. I also talked a little bit about my own struggles with anxiety and with OCD symptoms. And that's something I do when I work with patients. I do a lot of self-disclosure. I think it helps them to trust me a little bit more and what I have to say, that it's not just based on theory, that it's based on my own experience. And so I tried to bring some of that to the book so that it would be a little bit more personal, and hopefully people will give it what I have to say a little bit more credit, because I'm basing a lot of it on my own experience.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that. Absolutely. And it keeps it fresh, and sometimes more academic books, not when I say academic, you know what I mean, nonfiction, can be just, some of them can be boring, right? If I just put it very bluntly. So putting some personal experience in and stories just brings it to life.
Yeah. And try to put some humor in as well. I think that humor is really helpful, especially with OCD. And I tried to sort of model that we can approach this in a way that's not so heavy, right? And that's a little lighter, because, it's just, I just feel like it's part, feeling really upset about what's going on and feeling, that you're cursed with OCD, right? It's such a weight, right? And it can sort of leave you feeling very helpless, right? And so I think, just taking a step back from all of that, right? And we're talking about thoughts, we're talking about behaviors that are often, that are often things that are not, devastating and life-changing, right? And so maybe if we can approach this with a sense that the stakes are not so big, that we can actually feel a little bit more energized and be more open to making small changes. So I tried to kind of bring a little lightness in.
Yeah, I think that's really important. Absolutely. So look, thank you so much for coming on, sharing your book. It's great to speak to you again after all this time.
Thanks for having me, Stu. I really appreciate it. And honestly, the last time I was on here with you, we were talking about my other book, more about worry, and you got me thinking about OCD. And so I think you might have planted a seed that led to this book. So here we are. It's happened.
Yeah,
so
appreciate
thank
it.
you again. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this week's podcast. If you enjoy the OCD Stories podcast and would like to support us with a one-time tip/donation, please go to theocdstories.com/support. All tips, no matter how large or small, are greatly appreciated. Please subscribe and rate the show wherever you listen to the podcast.
And thank you to JS Health. And if you would like to get 15% off their entire range, head to jshealthvitamins.com and use the code OCD Stories at the checkout. The link will be in the episode description.
And thank you to NOCD for supporting our work. If you want to find out more about NOCD, head to go.treatmyocd.com/the-OCD stories or click the link in the episode description. And quick disclaimer, guys, this podcast is not therapy. It is not a replacement for therapy. Please seek treatment from a trained professional. And until we speak, take care.